Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Right now, you might just think of Halloween as an excuse to eat candy and buy a cheap mask. But we are going to trace how a staggering multi-billion-dollar modern holiday actually traces its roots back through a bizarre and complex patchwork of history.
It really is a wild ride.
Yeah, it is. We are going on a journey from ancient Celtic bonfires and portals to the fairy realm, to medieval Christian monks documenting oral myths, and eventually to English beggars carrying carved turnips. It is a story of how two completely different belief systems blended to create one enduring night of heightened spiritual activity.
Absolutely.
If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button, because today we are taking a deep dive into the mythology, the syncretism, and the incredible human behavior behind October 31st.
You know, it really is the perfect case study in human sociology and religion. When you look at Halloween today, I mean, the commercial surface is just blinding.
Oh, totally.
But beneath that plastic, we find this fascinating window into how human traditions evolve, like how completely separate cultures merge to solve similar existential fears.
Right. To understand the origin, though, we first have to look at the massive cultural and commercial engine Halloween has become, just to kind of establish the layers we are peeling back here. I mean, projections for U.S. consumer spending back in 2016 for Halloween were expected to hit $8 billion.
That is just a massive number.
$2 billion of that was expected to be spent on costumes alone. But what is truly captivating is that alongside that staggering economic data, there are still very real, deeply intertwined religious associations operating at the exact same time.
Yeah, you see this duality everywhere. You have Wiccan and modern pagan groups who actively celebrate October 31st as this highly significant, sacred time of year.
Right, places like Salem, Massachusetts.
Exactly. Salem becomes an absolute focal point for these modern observances. The spiritual weight of the day is taken very seriously by them.
And then on the exact opposite end of the religious spectrum, you have certain Christian groups expressing profound worry during this time. They cite concerns over heightened demonic activity, warning their congregations against participating in what they view as an invocation of dark spiritual forces.
So you end up with this single 24-hour period that functions as a secular party for millions, a sacred religious night for some, and a night of intense spiritual caution for others.
Which makes it a total goldmine for scholars studying this stuff.
I know for sure.
Yeah.
But to find the root of that spiritual charge, we actually have to bypass the modern era entirely. We need to shift our focus to pre-Christian Ireland to look for a seasonal holiday called Samhain.
And just for anyone reading the historical text, the spelling looks like Samhain, but it is actually pronounced so-in.
Yes, so-in. Because we are dealing with pre-4th century Ireland here, before the region was Christianized, we are looking at a fundamentally agrarian society. Samhain was a major seasonal festival in the Celtic calendar.
Celebrated right from the evening of October 31st until the evening of November 1st, marking the official start of the winter season.
Right, and the transition into winter for an ancient agrarian society was not about pumpkin spice lattes and cozy sweaters. It was a period of extreme anxiety.
Life or death, basically.
Literally.
Yeah.
The harvest was over, the earth was dying, and the harsh Celtic winter was closing in. You were culling the livestock you couldn't feed through the winter and just hoping your stored grain would last until spring.
The stakes were astronomical, which naturally breeds this desperate need to control or at least predict the outcome of the season. But we run into a significant historical problem here. We are analyzing a pre-literate society.
Yes, we are.
So relying on the source materials provided, I have to question the validity of our own historical receipts. I mean, the firm evidence for Samhain is incredibly scarce from the period itself. Much of what we know comes from the Irish sagas of Celtic mythology.
Which weren't written down until between the 9th and 12th century CE.
Right. And that gap of several hundred years is the great irony of this history.
It really is. The traditions have been passed down generation after generation through oral tradition, and the individuals who finally put pen to parchment were Christian monks.
So I'm going to push back on the reliability of these texts. If Christian monks are writing down stories of a pre-Christian pagan society centuries after the fact, and we know they layered their own theological worldview onto the populations they converted, aren't we essentially reading medieval fan fiction of Celtic history?
That is a very fair point.
How do historians untangle what was actually an original practice of Samhain versus what was simply a Christianized embellishment designed to fit a new religious narrative?
Well, historians and folklore experts face that exact methodological hurdle. It is incredibly difficult to separate the pure original source from the Christianized layer. The monks absolutely injected Christian morality and characteristics into the sagas.
I mean, of course they did.
But scholars like Jack Santino argue that the texts are not completely compromised. Santino's analysis suggests that the underlying structural elements of the sagas, like the locations, the timing of events, the specific fears of the people, all of that survives the Christian filter.
Oh, okay. So the monks might have reframed the deities as demons or historical kings, but the core events still give us a useful picture.
Exactly. The core events of the Samhain festival still provide a tangible historical picture of pre-Christian Irish life.
So let's look at that surviving picture. The overriding theme in the sagas is not just agricultural survival. It is the concept of a liminal space. Samhain was believed to be a day of heightened spiritual activity where the veil between worlds thinned out.
Yeah, and the texts don't describe abstract, glowing sci-fi portals. They describe natural geographical features.
Like specific hills or burial mounds.
Right, or caves, physically opening up to function as passages for spirits, fairies, and the souls of the dead to cross into our world.
A prime example of this is the 12th century saga called The Boyhood Deeds of Fionn. It explicitly states that the fairy mounds of Ireland were always open around Samhain.
Noting that on this specific night, nothing could ever be hidden in the fairy mounds.
I mean, consider the psychological weight of that belief. You are already facing starvation and freezing temperatures, and suddenly the doors to the other world are kicked wide open. It implies this sudden, terrifying vulnerability.
The landscape itself turns hostile. But the interaction between humans and this other realm was actually incredibly active.
Right, because in another medieval saga, the Book of Lismore, we find an account of a female fairy who emerges specifically on Samhain to reveal secrets.
So the open veil wasn't just a threat, it was a resource. The original practices of Samhain heavily revolved around prophecy, storytelling, and divination.
If the spirits are wandering the earth anyway, humanity could interrogate them to figure out who is going to survive the winter.
Exactly. And the mechanics of that divination bring us to the physical rituals, specifically the bonfires. The historical record indicates these were massive communal blazes.
And the word bonfire itself originally comes from bone fire, right? Referring to the animal bones from the culled livestock being thrown into the flames.
Yes. And the function of those fires is heavily debated. Some scholars hypothesize they acted as spiritual lighthouses, meant to guide friendly spirits of ancestors into the world.
Oh, interesting.
While others argue the exact opposite, suggesting the fires and the foul-smelling smoke from the bones were meant to aggressively ward away harmful fairies and malevolent entities.
But practically, they served as the central gathering point for the community's divination rituals. Druids or community leaders would read the way the bones cracked in the heat.
Or interpret the shapes of the flames and the direction of the smoke to predict the future.
You have a society using fire to pierce the veil and extract survival data from the spirit realm. It's wild. But we should clarify that Halloween is not a Celtic holiday that miraculously survived intact in a vacuum.
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
It was subjected to a massive, deliberate process of cultural syncretism by the Christian Church.
And the name itself is the most obvious artifact of that collision. Halloween is an allusion, like a linguistic running together of the phrase All Hallows Eve,
Because it falls on the night before All Hallows Day.
which is more commonly known today as All Saints' Day, celebrated on November 1st by the Roman Catholic Church to honor all the saints in Christianity.
Right. And it is immediately followed by All Souls Day on November 2nd, which is a day dedicated to praying for newly departed souls and martyrs.
So there is a very popular narrative surrounding this calendar alignment. The story goes that the Roman Catholic Church saw the indigenous pagans celebrating Samhain on November 1st with their fairy mounds and divination fires, and the church maliciously slapped a Christian holiday directly on top of it to crush the pagan traditions.
Basically a hostile takeover to forcibly convert the Irish.
Yeah, but while it's an appealingly simple narrative of conquest, the historical and geographic reality is far more complex.
We have to examine the broader geographic context of early Christianity to really understand the mechanics of this shift. Nearly all Christian groups in late antiquity and the early medieval period had an All Saints' Day.
But the critical detail is that they did not all celebrate it on November 1st. The research points out that Christian churches in places like Syria and Greece were celebrating their All Saints' Day in the spring and summer.
Generally around the time of Pentecost.
Right, so the holiday was not universally invented out of thin air in November just to suppress Samhain.
Exactly. By the year 800 CE, however, Christian groups, specifically in the British Isles and Germany, were the ones celebrating it on November 1st.
And I want to use a specific analogy here to explain the mechanics of how this happened. It was less of a hostile corporate takeover where the new parent company completely eradicates the old company culture, and much more like a slow, negotiated corporate merger.
Oh, that's a great way to frame it.
Because the old Celtic traditions of Samhain were so deeply embedded in the local psychological calendar of the Agrarian year that trying to ban them would have caused a revolt. So instead of fighting the local employees, the church blended the cultures.
They kept the massive bonfires and the focus on the dead, but gave those practices new management titles, like, you can keep your bonfire, but now it is dedicated to St. Patrick, not the fairy realm.
Yeah, the corporate merger analogy perfectly captures this sociological process at work. The church absorbed the emotional resonance of the season and redirected it toward Christian theology.
And we actually have direct textual evidence of this blending in progress. An old Irish calendar written by a Christian monk from the 9th century still refers to November 1st as Samhain, even while integrating it into the Christian liturgical year.
So the Celtic holiday demonstrably influenced the placement and the supernatural atmosphere of All Saints' Day in Western Europe. We have the date, the spooky liminal atmosphere of the open fairy mounds, and the Catholic emphasis on praying for dead souls.
But we are still missing the mechanical link to modern behavior.
Yeah.
I mean, none of this ancient history directly explains the physical traditions we associate with the holiday.
Right. Cultural historian Dr. Nicholas Rogers provides the vital distinction here in his exhaustive history of Halloween. He notes that while Samhain gave Halloween its supernatural charge and an intrinsic liminality, it did not offer much in the way of the actual ritual practices we recognize today.
Yeah, the atmosphere is ancient Celtic, but the physical activities are surprisingly recent.
Which is so surprising to learn.
Most of our recognizable rituals developed much later, during the early modern period. We're talking the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, in a Europe that was already fully Christianized and deeply entrenched in Catholic and Protestant theology.
So let's analyze the mechanics of the costumes then. Dressing up is the foundational pillar of modern Halloween, but its origins track back to 16th century Ireland, Scotland, and Wales.
And people started dressing in costumes to celebrate All Saints' Day as a practical survival strategy.
Right. If you genuinely believe the veil between worlds is gone and malevolent spirits are physically wandering your village, blending in is your best defense. The costumes were basically a form of supernatural camouflage.
You dress as a demon or a spirit so that the actual demons pass right by you.
It is a profound shift in the human relationship with fear. Instead of hiding from the terrifying entities of the dark, the populace decided to mimic them. They took on the visual identity of the threat.
Which is brilliant, honestly. And that brings us to the origins of trick-or-treating, which feels like a uniquely modern American invention fueled by the candy industry.
Totally.
But the mechanism behind going door to door actually originates from a deeply theological practice in England called souling.
And souling was intimately tied to the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. According to this theology, souls who died with unconfessed sins were trapped in a state of agonizing purification before they could enter heaven.
And the living believed they could shorten a soul's time in purgatory through prayer.
Which created this fascinating spiritual economy. Poor individuals, often children or beggars, would literally go from door to door asking for food. It was a direct transaction.
They asked for sustenance, and in return they promised to pray for the trapped deceased relatives of that household. And instead of miniature chocolate bars, they were paid in special pastries called soul cakes.
Every cake eaten represented a soul freed from purgatory. The theological weight of the exchange was immense initially, but over time, the solemnity degraded into a more rhythmic cultural habit.
Yeah, I think you have a quote that illustrates that, right?
I do. I have a quote from an author writing in 1880 that illustrates this degradation beautifully. The author observes children's souling, stating that the children go around to the houses early and late on All Saints' Day, not on All Souls' Day, and sing monotonously a doggerel.
The text describes them going around in little groups of 3 to 6, singing for their food. It is the direct ancestor of modern trick-or-treaters demanding sugar.
And the visual aesthetic of these groups in the 19th century introduces another iconic symbol. To navigate the dark, unlit roads between houses, these soulers carried lanterns.
But they weren't carrying the large orange pumpkins we carve today. They were carrying little lanterns carved out of turnips.
The original jack-o'-lanterns were root vegetables. Have you ever seen a carved turnip?
The historical photographs are deeply unsettling.
They are the most terrifying objects imaginable. A pumpkin is round and vibrant. It looks somewhat friendly even when carved with sharp teeth.
Yeah, pumpkins are cute.
But a carved turnip is pale, asymmetrical, and looks exactly like a shrunken, screaming human head. It is infinitely scarier than a pumpkin.
Oh, the terrifying aesthetic was completely intentional. Those early turnip lanterns were entirely serious implements. The glowing coal placed inside the hollowed-out root had a dual purpose.
In some traditions, the hideous face was meant to physically frighten away the harmful spirits wandering the night.
And in other traditions, the burning coal inside the pale, thin skin of the turnip was meant to symbolize the agonizing state of a soul trapped in the fires of purgatory.
So you have this incredibly grim medieval act. Children carrying a shrunken root vegetable that represents a soul burning in purgatory, walking through the freezing dark to trade prayers for bread.
Yeah.
And the fact that this specific ritual eventually evolved into children wearing licensed superhero pajamas and demanding highly processed sugar is just the ultimate cultural game of telephone.
It really is. And the evolution of that behavior was heavily influenced by another historical event that injected the rowdy, mischievous atmosphere we associate with Halloween today. Dr. Rogers argues that the modern tone of the holiday owes a massive debt to Guy Fawkes Day on November 5th.
Guy Fawkes Day commemorates the failed gunpowder plot of 1605, when a group of English Catholics attempted to blow up the Protestant King James I in Parliament.
After the plot was foiled, the government encouraged the populace to light bonfires to celebrate the king's survival.
And over the centuries, November 5th became an incredibly rowdy, anti-establishment holiday in England. People would burn effigies of the Pope or Guy Fawkes, set off fireworks, and children would roam the streets aggressively demanding a penny for the guy.
It was a night of sanctioned chaos, vandalism, and mischief.
So when the Industrial Revolution occurred and population shifted, the raucous, slightly menacing energy of the November 5th celebrations began to bleed into the October 31st traditions brought over by Irish and Scottish immigrants.
The threat of a trick in trick-or-treat, like the idea that if you don't hand over a treat, your property will be vandalized, is a direct inheritance from the chaotic energy of Guy Fawkes Day mingling with the supernatural dread of Samhain.
We end up with an astonishing historical composite. You have the ancient Celtic fear of the winter and the open fairy mounds merged with the Catholic theology of purgatory and praying for the dead.
All injected with the rebellious, fiery mischief of a 17th century political assassination attempt.
Right. If we pull all these disparate threads together, we can really see how millennia of human anxiety and ingenuity built the modern behemoth we celebrate today.
We started with an agrarian society, terrified of starvation, lighting massive bonfires to guide spirits and divine the future.
Then we watched the Christian church orchestrate a brilliant cultural merger, mapping the celebration of saints and the rescue of burning souls over the existing seasonal dread.
And we tracked how survival camouflage evolved into costumes, how a spiritual economy of soul cakes became a candy grab, and how the terrifying glow of a carved turnip paved the way for the modern jack-o'-lantern.
Despite the commercialization, the plastic masks, and the billions of dollars spent, the foundational architecture of the holiday remains surprisingly intact.
There really is a single, unbroken thread connecting a pre-Christian Irish farmer to a modern 21st century neighborhood costume party.
It is the enduring collective cultural agreement that October 31st is a day of heightened spiritual activity. We may disagree on the mechanics, whether it involves the fairies of Celtic mythology crossing a thin veil, the demons of Christian theology roaming the earth, or just children pretending to be monsters for a night.
But we all agree to participate in the liminality of the date.
It highlights a core human psychological need. We continuously reinvent the physical rituals, but the fundamental desire to confront the dark, to playfully engage with our deepest fears, and to acknowledge the vast unknown remains completely unchanged across thousands of years.
It really is a testament to human nature.
It leaves you with a fascinating paradox to ponder. In our hyper-rational, technology-driven modern world, a society where we can explain almost everything with data, satellite imagery, and scientific consensus, why do we still fiercely protect and wildly celebrate this one single night a year where we collectively pretend the veil between worlds is thin?
That is the big question.
When you are standing at your front door handing out candy this year, look at the carved pumpkins and the costumes and consider this. Are we merely participating in a multi-billion-dollar consumer habit, or, deep down in our psychology, are we secretly still longing for the ancient magic, the terror, and the mystery of an open fairy mound?